Hello, I'm Dr. Esmacher. Welcome to today's session on American culture in the 1950s. So, we've been talking in previous classes when we've touched on the 50s about McCarthyism and this paranoia over communists at home in the United States during the early 1950s. Now we're going to shift over to talking a little bit more about the broader context of the 1950s and touching a little bit towards the end of today's session on shifting politics of the 50s. And the next session, we'll be talking about Eisenhower and a little bit more Americans' politics and foreign policy towards the end of the 1950s. So, the 1950s is the height of an economic golden age for the United States. From 1946 to 1973, the United States economy is booming. The gross national product doubles between 1946 and 1960. And what separates this particular time period's prosperity from earlier ones that we've looked at earlier this semester, like the Gilded Age in the late 1800s and the Roaring 20s, is that this era of prosperity benefits all social classes. We see an increased standard of living as the real wages or the buying power of wages increase for Americans, as Americans have access to better food resources at cheaper prices, so the American diet improves considerably. There is a housing construction boom, and again, because of good jobs and good prices, it's more affordable than ever before for Americans to own homes as well. And there's more access to education and recreation. There's more access to higher education in part because of the GI Bill, which many veterans of World War II took advantage of to go to college in increasing numbers and improve their education. But we also see, again, because of this prosperity over the general economy, even members of the working class who are left out of prosperity in the earlier time periods are benefiting from this booming economy and able to more afford to participate in consumer culture and buying things and engaging in leisure activities, which were previously not an option for them. This is also a time period where we have a rising middle class, so more and more Americans could be considered middle class. By 1960, about 60%, 60, of the American population was considered middle class. And the poverty rate in the United States is still at about 22% during the 1950s, but considering that the poverty rate had been 30% during the times of the Great Depression, this was an improvement. So there are still poor people in the golden age between 1946 and 1973, but on the whole, they are better off than poor people in earlier decades. We also have rising technological innovations during this time period. For example, those of us who live in the Southwest or the South will be very thankful for the invention of air conditioning, which drastically expands settlement in places like Houston and Phoenix because it makes it more livable. We also have television, which was first invented in the 1920s, started to be marketed at the end of the 30s, but because of World War II, most consumers are not going to be familiar with television until after World War II in the late 40s and early 50s. So television, we'll talk about in more detail shortly, is a huge technological innovation. It drastically changes the way Americans consume information and their leisure time. Americans are also able to afford air travel in greater numbers than before, even though the aviation industry had started in the 1920s. We're going to see air travel now becoming more affordable and less accessible for the average American in the 1950s and beyond. There are also expansions of household appliances, like, for example, dishwashers are introduced and at a price point that most consumers can afford. And really, what drastically changes the game for a lot of Americans is the expansion of what we today would kind of consider basic living necessities. Things like access to electricity, central heating, indoor plumbing, which we today take for granted, are relatively new applications across building industry in this time period. So again, the average quality of life, even for people living below the poverty line at this time period, goes up because of the embrace of these innovations at the time as now the standards that we know them to be today. So, what's behind this big growth in the economy during this early Cold War period? There is a direct correlation between the Cold War and economic prosperity, in part because government contracts help to revitalize certain industries and to expand the economy in certain areas. So the government invests very heavily in defense related industries. So, for example, on the West Coast, we see the expansion of aircraft manufacturing. Places like Boeing, right, headquartered in Seattle, grow very prosperous with government contracts. In the Northeast, where industrial manufacturing had been declining, we're actually going to see a temporary rebound due to the construction of submarines for the US military. In the South, we're also going to see shipyards that had popped up along the Gulf Coast during World War II continue to be used to produce ships for the Cold War for the Navy. But we also see this trend of expanding and new military bases across the South that had started during World War II continue during the Cold War. So government contracts in these areas related to defense and the military are going to be a great economic boom for these areas. And we can see that in places like El Paso, where the expansion of Fort Bliss during World War II continues after World War II into the Cold War and is a great economic engine for the city of El Paso and contributes to its growth. In addition to the defense industries, we also have a rise of white collar workers. So, if you've ever heard the phrase blue collar, white collar, here's what it means. Back during the time period where the vast majority of the working class worked manual labor jobs, so think about heavy jobs like foundry workers or, say, construction jobs, the idea was that you wore denim. This is where denim originates, right? Blue jeans from the working class because it hid dirt pretty well. It was really easy to clean, a no nonsense fabric. And then if you had a more sort of inside desk job, then you could wear, say, like white button down shirts, right? Stuff that you could wear because you weren't sweating and getting dirty, right? So this is where that white collar, blue collar thing comes in. So blue collar denotes people who are from the working class, who are still probably working more heavily manual labor jobs. White collar denotes somebody who's working a skilled job or a job that doesn't require manual labor. So during the 1950s, we have an increase of American workers that could be classified as white collar or clerical workers. Clerical workers increased by 25%. So think about, like, for example, administrative assistants. Corporate employees, so Americans working for large corporations, increased by 60%. And for the first time in American history, by 1956, white collar workers outnumbered blue collar workers. Okay. This was a big shift. This is going to also be a long-term shift as the United States starts to shift away from a manufacturing economy into more of a service-oriented and information-oriented economy. We will see an increase in commercial farms, despite the fact that the population of the United States involved in farming actually drops. In the 1950s, we see the number of Americans working in agriculture drop from 23 million to 15 million. However, during the same time period, there's a 50% increase in agricultural output. So we have less people working in agriculture, but more products being produced. And part of the reason for this increase in production, despite the fact that the workforce is declining in agriculture, is the use of technology, the use of machinery to harvest products, the use of pesticides and fertilizers to reduce the loss due to pests and to increase the growth rate of these products, and the use of irrigation, opening more land to cultivation. This is especially helpful for expanding farming in the West, where in large regions of the West, water is a concern, so irrigation is vitally important. And we also see the establishment of large corporate farms in areas like the West Coast, so think like California, in part because all of this technology, all of these tools take money and investment and capital. So this increasingly means that farms are going to be large-scale commercial operations, not your small mom and pop setups like it traditionally happened during American history. We also see the beginning of a process called deindustrialization in the 1950s. So, this is a term for the decline of manufacturing. The number of industrial workers in the United States starts to drop beginning in the 1950s, partly due to increased mechanization in production, eliminating the need for more human workers, and the decline of union membership in the 1950s related to, as we talked about, the fear of communism and radical politics. So this will begin America's shift towards a more service-oriented economy that we still see in the United States today.